Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the No Payne podcast. Happy to have you join us for the 49th episode. We're pretty close to a large milestone for us, that being 50 episodes of the No Payne podcast. But we'll have to wait until next week until we hit that big milestone, so it'll be certainly a long wait, and we are very excited to be streaming the 50th episode. But in the meantime, episode 49 will do, and I'm happy to announce we once again have the Grand Master, the Big Daddy, the best boss in the world, Mr. Mike Payne himself, streaming in live from outside of the city. Mike, how are you doing today?
Oh, here I am. It's like, need some angel music.
Angel music, yeah, that'd be nice.
That's a good intro, man. Thanks.
Thank you. I've had 49 episodes of practice.
Yeah. Sweet, man. No, it's good. Yeah, can't believe we're trucking along. It's really great idea that we've been getting these podcasts out there. And today, I'm hoping that we can give people a more functional kind of podcast in terms of roof inspections. And I'm hoping that people can find it pretty helpful because we just kind of I think what we should be doing here is just helping homeowners be able to inspect their own roof if they want to, or hire us if they figure that they like the podcast and seem like we're pretty knowledgeable,
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're not money grabbers. I mean, we certainly want to spread this information and give homeowners an opportunity to perform maintenance themselves, or at least be able to identify issues on their own roof without having to spend the money on an inspection fee. So it certainly is a worthwhile podcast topic for us. I mean, spreading knowledge is certainly an admirable pursuit, if I can't say so myself.
Sure.
Or would say so myself.
Well, I would say probably one of the hardest parts for a homeowner doing an inspection would probably be just the ventilation, because we've been on quite a journey when it comes to finding out how to do ventilation properly. And so I mean, I think that one, we'll try to explain that through this through this podcast the best we can, but hopefully we can explain enough where somebody can at least know if there's an issue on the roof with their ventilation. So I guess without any further ado, feel free to interject anytime that you feel that you need to, as you are the main inspector for No Payne Roofing nowadays. I'm just going to start with the outside. So basically, just trying to visualize what I do when I come up to a roof. First thing I do is I do a visual inspection from the ground. So, street view, I'll be just looking for, any shingles that might be lifted. I'll be checking for the model of the shingle. With the usual architectural shingles that we have now, their maximum lifespan would be 30 years. So when a homeowner calls me, I'll ask them, hey, when was your house built? And how old is the roof you have on there now? And generally I can tell from even Google Earth, whether this is going to be a replacement or not. So if it's an old 3-tab and they said it was built 20 years ago, and it's the first roof they ever had, I'm like, okay, well, an inspection, might be necessary, but it's pretty much a foregone conclusion that it needs to be replaced. But that being said, if I'm coming up to a roof, first thing we'll do, visual inspection around the roof, look for wear and tear from the ground. The first thing I'll try to check for is soft metal damages. So like if the eaves troughs have denting or anything on them, then I'll know, okay, there's some hail damage here. And that's, for Calgary's climate, I think number one thing I like to check for before I, get up on a roof is just any hail damage on the ground, from the ground anyway. And then from there, I set my ladder up and I'm going to go up onto the roof. But before I get onto the roof, first thing I do is I check the shingle overhang. I check to see if there's drip edge, and I check to see if how the underlayment is installed. So the manufacturers have different different expectations, but for the most part, they're all pretty much the same in a lot of respects.
Wow, that was a very
says,
Sorry, no, I just got a call from somebody who knows we're streaming, and it just interrupted you mid-sentence. Thanks, Carly. Thanks, Lady Love. I'm sure she'll see this in the future and realize that that was certainly quite the visual interruption for our viewers. But anyways, only a minor issue. Continue, Mike.
No problem. So if there's no drip edge on your roof, what I say is that you got to have at least overhang on the first row of paper that goes on there. So ICO wants like a half inch to a quarter inch of overhang on and even if there's drip edge, they still want overhang with their underlayment. For CertainTeed, I think it could be, they don't really talk about it because they say that you should just have drip edge all the time. But basically, the drip edge, if you have, oh, sorry, I'm getting a little bit of feedback.
I can hear you fine. No issues on this end.
Okay, I could hear myself talking first. Anyways, so if you have the drip edge and the paper is going over top of the drip edge, that's fine. If it's going underneath the drip edge, then I would say you still need that, half inch of overhang or something, just so, because when the water goes, it might get underneath the drip edge. So we want it, not touching the wood decking. A really big issue I see is that, I'll lift up the first shingles and I'll see like an inch gap between the plywood and the underlayment.
Right.
That's not good. Second thing I'll check for before I get on the roof is I'll check for the spacing. But are the starters lined up? Is there like
an appropriate stagger between the starter strip and the edge of the shingle that lies on top of the starter strip? Exactly.
Sorry, I'm getting feedback. I can hear myself talking, so it's like it's okay now. But and anyway, so yeah, you don't want shingles lining up. You need to have the stagger. So like for ICO, you'll want a 10-inch stagger or like offset, and then with a CertainTeed, they're okay with a 6-inch. So the problem that some guys run into is that they'll be an inch under, and technically it's a fail. But
right.
From a homeowner's perspective, I would say, look, it's an inch isn't going to make a huge difference. Where it's getting to a problem is if it's a low slope and that your joints are lining up or pretty close within, let's say, like a few inches, then it's like, okay, this roof needs to be basically ripped off, or you could just assume that it's going to start leaking long before its life expectancy is up. Next thing that homeowners should check for on their roof is they might need to bring a pry bar or something up, but lift up a shingle and then check the nail pattern. So the nails need to be on the line or within the nail zone, and they need to be spaced properly. They need to be flush. They can't be driven through or under driven. And some shingles require 6 nails for their storm warranty. Others, but it seems like the universal is a minimum of 4 nails per shingle. So that you got to check for that. What else am I going to say with that? Oh yeah, and then when you bring the shingle back down, you're probably going to need to reseal it. So like you lift it up, you say, okay, the nails are okay or they're not. Whatever, take some you need an asphalt, like an asphalt-based caulking to seal it back down.
Right.
If you don't,
yeah. Once you pry up the shingle to inspect nail placement and nail quantity, you'll certainly, disrupt the asphalt sealant that was pre-existing. If you don't reseal it, as you've mentioned, you can certainly create, or in other words, allow for a potential blow-off if we were to have heavy winds or any major disruptions or weather changes. So replacing that asphalt seal is certainly extremely important.
Exactly. But next thing you might notice is that when you pull up that shingle or lift that shingle, it might come up real easy and you don't need your pry bar. That means that you have a potential manufacturer issue. or your whole roof might need a reseal. And in that case, it doesn't mean that your roof is garbage. It just means that you need to basically just reseal the whole thing. That can generally cost, if you hire somebody, a couple $1,000. Do it yourself. It's probably going to take you a good day and a half, 2 days to seal it all back down. I mean, depending on the size of the roof, of course. So
right. Well, sorry to interrupt, Mike. Just one point on just the potential resealing. You mentioned that there is a chance that it may be a manufactured defect, but that really, I guess, comes down to the age of the roof overall, because from what I know, if you do experience any deteriorated seals on the roof itself within that first 11 years, then it could be a potential manufactured defect. But if the roof is, say, between 12 or 20 years old, then it is likely time itself or natural deterioration of the product that would result in the necessary reseal. So I guess there's a difference between, say, a manufactured defect and an actual just common deterioration of the asphalt seal itself.
Well, there's a reason why they have wind warranties that last only 11 to 15 years, is because it generally tends to degrade over that time. But I would still say technically it's a manufacturer issue, but the manufacturer's not going to cover it after 11 years. But right. I mean, I think that most people should just assume that their shingles should be resealed at about year 15, or at least checked for and I think a reseal is super important, because you can extend the roof life like massively. I think after you glue that thing down another time, you never have to worry about it again in terms of peeling up in the wind. They'll give it 10 years more at least.
Yeah, so long as there's no major surface damage or any major leak potential, there's a good chance that resealing the shingles, in order to prevent any major blow-off scenarios, you could certainly extend the lifespan, as you've said.
Yeah, exactly. And so moving on from that, I think the capping, I would check the capping next. That one there, I find capping is one of the most problematic, when it comes to being nailed. A lot of guys, when they're nailing it, they're just not nailing it properly. You get a lot of blow throughs, a lot of just nails not landing properly. And by blow through, I mean the nail has gone through the first layer or even second layer of shingle, so like they're just kind of loosely sitting on there. You only need 2 nails per cap, but we like to go over and beyond and do 4 per. But capping may also need to be resealed as well.
Right. I tend to find that I'm sorry, Mike, interjecting here, left, right, and center, but yeah, I find that the asphalt sealant on the capping pieces are actually much thinner than what you'd find on the underside of your average architectural shingle. I'm not sure. I think it's likely because the capping themselves are much lighter and maybe less prone to blow-offs, or they need, I guess, less sealant in that case. But I do find that the asphalt sealant is a little thinner. So I think they are certainly potentially more prone to deterioration of the seals themselves over time.
Sure.
One other thing.
Yeah, and they tend to wear out. They tend to wear out quicker, the caps as well. I found we've come across. Nowadays we're coming across a lot of architectural roofs that are supposed to go 30 years or whatever, and the capping is wearing out at like year 15, year 20. So like I think that a lot of roofs need a full new recap. More often than not.
Yeah, it's not uncommon for us to issue estimates that revolve around replacing either the entirety of the capping on the property or even certain sections, but it is something that we find fairly often. So there is one comment that was made here by Brick Home Inspections Calgary. They had mentioned that you have to be extra careful when you are lifting shingles to check for nail placement and what have you during the winter months, because of the potential to damage the shingle more easily because of the sub-zero temperatures. So there certainly is an added increase in damage potential when the shingle is practically frozen. So it's certainly wise to be extra careful in that situation.
Yeah. It's kind of a double-edged sword, because I mean in the summertime, depending on the brand like Malarkey, it's stuck so tight when it's warm out that it's like, how do you, like, you can wreck the shingle just lifting it up that way. And then in the wintertime, sometimes it just comes up so nice, but then it can be incredibly brittle sometimes too, and then you end up wrecking the shingle. I think the best thing that somebody can do if they crack a shingle is just use some asphalt-based underlayment and do kind of like just a little bit like kind of like an S pattern, and you just kind of squish it down, and you'll see a little bit of bleed through come through the crack. And I think that's generally okay. But if it's past the point of return, then I would say you got to replace the shingle out. But
yeah, for sure. I just that last comment reminded me of, I guess, times where we would show up to site on a frosty morning and the shingles would be essentially frozen together inside the bundle wrapper itself. And I think that's primarily because of the fluctuations we get in temperature with the Chinooks and whatnot. Because if we do have any amounts of frost or ice in between the layers of the shingles, even when they are wrapped in their bundle, we get any warm temperatures and it will melt, of course, and then refreeze, and it can actually, as you said, lead to quite a lot of damage just actually removing the shingles from their wrapping right off the get-go. So it can be a finicky process throughout the winter.
Yeah, no, it sure can be. And that's why maybe inspections should probably be done in the spring or before the winter comes, because I think a leak is most likely to happen in the winter time. But there, I would say the next thing to inspect is the vents, the chimney, making sure the flashings have a diverter, make sure there's no holes that the water can get.
Right, you're cutting out. You're cutting out just a little bit here, but I know what you're saying. Yeah, first and foremost, you mentioned soft metals, but now to look at the chimney itself and the flashings associated with the chimney, there's a good chance that there could be pre-existing nail holes that weren't sealed, or even nails that are lifted, for that matter. There are usually certain areas of the chimney that have sealants as well, particularly around the rain collar and the top of the chase. And over time, those sealants can break down as well and become leak prone. So looking at those areas, I think, are also important.
Yep, 100%. So I think, why don't you go over the ventilation a little bit?
Sure, ventilation, yeah. So as Mike said, taking a look at the vents is one of the first things he would do when he gets on the roof. Typically on his way up the ladder is when he would take a closer look at the eaves trough for hail damage, as he mentioned, towards the beginning of the stream. He would also inspect whether or not a drip edge was installed on the eave ends of the roof, and from that area also he'd be able to see what type of underlayments they had used, at least on the eave end, because typically you would find a mixed match of underlayments if you had opted for synthetic underlayments or peel and stick underlayments as opposed to your standard asphalt 15 or 30 pound asphalt underlayments. So yeah, after looking at these areas and on your way up to the peak where the vents are, Mike also mentioned checking for loose shingles or blown through nails, things like that, which he had gone over. But yeah, once you get to the top of the roof, that's where ventilation starts to come into play. First and foremost, you'd want to, in my case anyways, I would pull out Google Earth and take a bird's eye view measurement of the total square footage of the attic space of the home that I'm inspecting, because it's very common that I find an inadequate amount of exhaust ventilation based on the size of the property itself. Outside of the amount of vents that we have, you certainly have to look at what style of vents they have installed as well, because it's very often we find very low profile vents that are maybe 3 inches thick or so, 3 inches tall, those standard square box vents that you would see on most residential homes. One thing about those vents, they are great vents, but that really depends on where you live. Partly because of the sort of climate that you live in. In this case, Calgary gets 2 or 3 feet of snow every winter, and depending on the pitch of the roof, you can certainly have a lot of snow coverage on the upper sections of the roof, which can actually inebriate the function of the exhaust vents themselves. So outside of the amount of vents you have, looking at what style you have installed is certainly important. And a lot of times I find very low profile vents on very low pitch roofs So you could imagine 2 or 3 feet of snow piling up on, say, a 412 or 3 or 4 512 pitch. You could visualize, these vents completely covered, and definitely having a lesser chance of properly ventilating the attic space. We opt
Right.
for.
Well,
Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
oh, wait, I was just going to say, all the vents need to be on the same side as well, and they all need to be level. You can't mix vents. We see it all the time. You'll have a bunch of mixed vents. So you want to have either all low profile or all high profile. You don't want to be having, whirlybirds next to low profile vents, as it'll cause a short circuit.
That's right.
Sometimes you'll see that are the lower portion of the roof. So like you'll have a dormer that's too low. And by dormer, I mean they're little triangle protrusions that come out of the roof. And but even sometimes if everything's level, I mean if I have two roofs intersecting with each other, even if the ridges are level, we want all the vents on the back side of the roof. And I say the back side because for visualization purposes, you want to not see the vents if possible.
Curb appeal.
Curb appeal, yeah. So, but I mean, one of the big issues that we have is a hip style roof. So where the roof kind of looks like a pyramid. Those little box vents don't do the trick. So if a homeowner has a hip style roof, you definitely want to make sure that you're using, let's say, high capacity vents, like a couple of whirlybirds or a couple of WeatherPro ventilators or something like that, rather than those little low profile vents. Because one, you can't put enough. There's not enough room to put those low profile vents to have, like they don't do enough attic space. Plus, they can't be adjacent from each other. Or they'll cause a short circuit system. That's what I wanted to add. But how about we now go into the attic? Inside the attic is just important to get on the roof.
Right. So, considering we are still on the topic of ventilation, we've been talking about exhaust ventilation for the attic, which is obviously extremely important. But the other half of the ventilation system itself depends on air intake. So air intake and exhaust both equally important. And so from the exterior of the home, you can certainly verify whether or not you have perforated soffits or closed soffits in certain areas of the home. And every neighborhood is slightly different in Calgary. Some areas of the home you'd find closed, some areas you'd find perforated. But this has a lot to do actually with the proximity of the neighboring home. It's actually a fire hazard to have perforated soffits, typically all along either side of the home. Because if the neighbor's home were to catch on fire, the perforated soffits, if they are not blocked underneath the perforated soffits, your home could actually pull smoke and sparks up into the attic space, thereby actually helping the fire to jump from one house to another. So you cannot fully evaluate whether or not you have adequate air intake from the exterior. And as Mike had said, going up into the attic and taking a look is also extremely important. So when we go up into the attic, if you're, say, not very interested in going up onto the roof, you are actually fairly able to identify how many and what type of exhaust vents you have installed on your roof from inside the attic, considering you can see the underside of the decking. When it comes to air intake, a good indication of adequate air intake is actually light streaming in from the eave ends of the roof inside the attic space. So typically I would have a headlamp, and I would use the red light on my headlamp so I can still see at least, and it actually makes it a little easier for me to take adequate photos to show the client. But I would clip on the red light and take a look towards the eave ends from inside the attic space, and normally looking in that area you would find baffles. For those of you who don't know what baffles are, it's essentially those cardboard inserts that you would find just above the eave ends. If you could imagine my flat hand being the baffles, this would being the ceiling of the home itself. All of the insulation would be piled underneath these baffles. The baffles are designed to stop the insulation from falling down into the soffitted areas. So normally in these areas is where you'd see the light streaming in if you have perforated soffits. So essentially I would look through every area of the attic space looking for light streaming in from the perforated soffits. And typically if I were to find large amounts of of light streaming in, say on around 80% or more of the entire attic space, I would say that we would have adequate air intake in order to supplement the exhaust vents that you have installed on the roof. But then again, adequate air intake is only half of the equation, and if you have an inadequate amount of exhaust ventilation, you'd have a lot of air coming in but not enough exiting, and for that reason you could allow for a lot of stagnant air. And stagnant air, I mean, as we will get to, will certainly help to increase the chances of condensation forming inside the attic and you experiencing attic rain come a Chinook or springtime. So if you'd like to elaborate on that, Mike, I certainly invite you to.
Sure. Well, the square inches that you have top of the needs to match the square inch coming in, and you can't have too air intake.
Can't have too much air intake, I think is what you said. You cut out just a little bit.
Yeah, you can't have too much air intake, but generally would say 50-50 in and out, or 60-40 in and out.
Sorry, you might want to repeat that again. You're getting a little crackly.
Yeah, I don't. I keep getting the bad feedback too.
Well, you will be back in town very soon, and we will not have to often deal with this whole streaming inside of a stream type setup that we have now. But anyways, I think what I heard you say was that you can never have too much air intake, but you certainly need to take into consideration the amount of square inches you have pertaining to exhaust ventilation. And I believe you had mentioned the 60-40 principle, if you want to elaborate on that.
Yes, well, I mean, 60% and 40%. So coming from up and under the eaves, you could say, so if it's, if you have 100, let's say 100, how do I explain this? So if I have a total of, let's say, 100 inches of vent top, then I would want about 20% more coming in at the bottom. So let's say 120 inches at the bottom.
Still coming through pretty choppy on this end, Mike, but I think you said if you had 100 square inches of exhaust ventilation, you'd want to find 120 square inches at least of air intake. Is that correct?
That's right.
Right. So yeah, obviously we're working with very, very small numbers for the example, but it helps to explain the principles that you would apply to full-size attic space or a large property, or any property for that matter.
Right. Well, since I'm coming in a little bit crackly, why don't you try explaining about attic condensation and how you'll detect that?
Yeah, for sure. Maybe you can go over to your router in the house and give it a couple smacks. See if you can try to knock a few extra signal strength bars out of it. But no, I can certainly elaborate on condensation issues, what causes it, and how to prevent it, because after all, that is my job nowadays. As Mike said, I am the primary inspector, and rather than just showing up, doing the inspection, giving them the photos, I actually take it upon myself and the company to provide worthwhile, I guess not worthwhile, what's the right word I'm looking for? Intricate explanations of what I'm seeing. I try to identify the issues first and foremost and explain them to the client in a way that is comprehensive, in a way that they can understand what's going on, because you'd be surprised. I mean, some of these principles are fairly easy to grasp, but not every client can very easily understand exactly what I'm talking about. And I've actually had a few complaints in the past when my wife was actually training with me or under me for about 4 or 5 months. I'd be sitting there explaining all these things to the client, and the client would be looking at her like, what? Like, what is he talking about, right? And so I kind of had to learn the hard way about, I guess, not getting a little too intricate with my explanations. But in other words, the spiel, if you want to call it that, goes a little bit like this. And for most circumstances, this is applicable. It's fairly universal in most cases. So I would tell the client that we typically see 3 major contributors in terms of condensation build up in the attic and the subsequent attic rain you would experience during warm weather. So the first contributor is insulation, essentially. Insulation plays a rather large role in terms of condensation, because the heat inside the home will obviously heat up the underside of the drywall for the ceiling. The heat will transfer through the drywall into the insulation. Although it's minimal, there is still a transfer. And over time, or I guess eventually, that heat will transfer through the insulation and interact with the cold air inside the attic. That's where insulation depth plays a big role.
One of the main things is that it's bringing the moisture from inside the house, not just the warm air. It's the humidity inside the house.
Yes, of course, humidity plays a big role as well. It's not only just rising through the drywall itself, but we have obviously lots of light fixtures and things like that on the ceiling. There are even areas like around the attic hatch that, if not sealed properly, can allow for air transfer. But yeah, as Mike was saying, humidity along with heat itself does play a big role, and insulation plays a big part in actually containing that heat. Hence, I guess what insulation really is designed for in the first place. So during the inspection, I'd be looking for at least a bare minimum of an R40 value of insulation, which translates to approximately or just about 14 inches of insulation. And one thing I've noticed is that over time, the insulation requirements on new home building actually changes. And so some homes that I've inspected that were built in, say, 1970 or 80, sometimes only have between 5 or 10 inches of insulation. When I say move into, say, the 1990s to 2010 or so, I start to see, more like 10, 12 inches. 12 inches is fairly common, but then most modern homes, I find a bare minimum of R40 or 14 inches. So again, the insulation levels play a large role, because the more insulation you have, the less heat will actually radiate, the less humidity will actually radiate from the ceiling, from the light fixtures and whatnot, into the cool air in the attic space and actually contribute to frost and ice buildup inside the attic. So insulation is certainly a fairly important aspect in terms of overall condensation control inside the attic.
It's insulation and vapor barrier are the big ones. But if you go inside your attic and you see a bunch of little droplets all over your insulation, then you definitely have a problem.
Yeah, definitely. There are telltale signs, and typically the insulation is light enough, or provides a great visual indication as to whether or not you have experienced attic rain or not. As Mike said, you can see staining throughout the insulation. You can sometimes see pools in the insulation where I guess more frost or ice was building up and more of it actually melted into the insulation. But yeah, that is certainly a telltale sign. There are visual indications in the insulation, as well as actually the underside of the decking, as well as the framing and the trusses inside the attic. You can typically find a lot of water staining. Sometimes you can find it just rolling down a single area where you'd see just localized frost and ice buildup. Sometimes it's widespread, but there are quite a few visual indicators, as Mike has explained.
Yeah. Another big one that's a contributor to the attic rain these days is loose HVAC connection.
Yeah, precisely. So that was actually number 2. As I said, there, in my experience and from what I explained to the clients, there are, I guess, 3 major contributors, one of which being insulation, the second being HVAC systems within the attic space. So typically your dryer exhaust, if it runs up through the ceiling and out the roof, and bathroom fan fixtures. So what's extremely important in this case is that you have airtight seals at the fan, or I guess where the dryer exhaust actually comes up through the ceiling, and at the exhaust port on the roof itself. And what I typically find is large amounts of water staining right around the exhaust vent on the roof decking, and large indentations in the insulation just below that area. So that's a clear indication that we have less than airtight connections in these systems, which would obviously result in a large amount of frost and ice buildup when we have below 0 temperatures. Typically when it's fairly cold, when these fans are running, a lot of warmth a lot of warm air and humidity from the bathroom is escaping directly into the attic, and when that mixes with the sub-zero temperatures, it would result in large amounts of frost and ice buildup. Although it is typically localized in those areas around the fan fixtures or around the exhaust ports for those fixtures, it can contribute to overall humidity levels and overall attic rain inside the attic.
Right. Yeah. I think it covers it pretty good.
Yeah, that does. There is a third indicator as well. As we already talked about, ventilation also plays a fairly large role in this. And in some cases, I actually determined that ventilation is the largest contributor outside of insulation and properly connected airtight bath fan exhaust fixtures and dryer exhaust. Because as I said before, you could say have large amounts or adequate amounts of air intake coming into the attic, but if you have inadequate amounts of exhaust, that would still allow for a lot of stagnant air. And so if we have, say, humidity and warm air from inside the home radiating into the attic through either the light fixtures or the attic hatch, or even radiating from the insulation itself, if you have inadequate amounts of insulation, if that air is not properly expelled from the attic space, then that can also be a fairly large contributor if you have stagnant air in the attic or a lack of airflow. So I typically explain to clients how these three elements all combined are usually the result, or I guess in other words, if we find inadequacies in either of these three categories, you can certainly expect to see some form of condensation issues inside the attic.
Okay, well, that sounds about right. Well, given our feedback issues right now, I said we should just cut this podcast short here, and we'll have to make a part 2.
Yeah, I understand. We are having a little bit of technical difficulties in this case. I'm not sure the best way to go around it, but I guess outside of the poor connection we're tending to get, I decided to use my personal phone for this streaming here because of the fact that I use an Android phone, and my Android phone is the only phone that can actually connect wirelessly to this flat screen TV without the use of all of these third-party apps and all of these other things you need, right? And of course, now I'm getting phone calls and Facebook notifications and whatnot. So it's been a little bit of a gong show, but I think most importantly, we were able to get across some of the most major points of inspection outside of the roof, or sorry, outside of the attic and inside. So I think there is valuable information to be digested from this stream, but I do think there's a lot more to talk about, and we can certainly elaborate further, go over other pointers at a future date.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do a part 2.
Do you think part 2 would be worthy for our 50th live stream?
I don't know. We'd have to definitely figure out the feedback then.
No, I understand. We can talk more about that, but regardless, we ran for a good half hour or so, and I think, as I said, we covered some of the most major issues. And we did have another comment come in here from Brick by Brick.
Okay.
He explained basically, or made a fairly accurate point here, that the insulation guys blowing in the insulation typically don't really care if he blocks the soffit vents or not. I didn't word that verbatim, but I do often find a freshly topped up insulation job, but it seems like trying to hit those lower areas of the attic space near the baffles, they'll just kind of shoot her up towards the upper side of the decking. And I've seen soffit baffles completely stuffed full of insulation, and I guess that's where workmanship itself really just comes into play. Taking care not to interrupt airflow and whatnot, and I find that more often than not.
Yeah, 100%, man.
Yeah, true that. Well, anyways, yes, Mike, it's been great talking with you, of course. I'm happy that you chose to chime in and have this conversation with me. It's a nice little brush up for me as well, because you've made some points that I sometimes don't always consider. But for me to kind of go through the information that I provide to clients during inspections, and for not to hear any major concerns on your end is heartwarming, I should say. because you certainly trained me well. And I am certainly honored to, to be in the position that I'm in, because it certainly shows a level of trust from the higher ups, and I've got nothing to complain about. So
You got trust. You're the main.
right on, Mike. Well, you're the main man. You're the greatest boss of all time. So keep it up. Anyways,
Right.
So
Right, man,
thanks.
well-
Sorry.
Oh, no, nothing. No, carry on.
Yep, carry on. I was just gonna do the good old outro. Thanking the viewers and thanking those who had taken the time to chime in and leave comments, of course. And again, thanking Mike for being a part of it. I guess obviously every time we do this, we rely on wireless internet connections, and sometimes it doesn't go as planned. So if we decide to do this again before you're back in town, which will be fairly soon, we'll be sure to try to work out these bugs and do what we can to at least provide a quality stream next time around. Makes me
100%.
wonder. They should probably just throw Ethernet ports on cell phones nowadays. Could you imagine that? You can just plug your phone straight into the
Fiber
router.
optic.
Yeah, that'd be cool. Okay, well, thanks a lot, Mike. This will be ready to share around and ready to spread the good news in a few minutes here. So, again, thank you, Mike. And to the viewers, of course, we apologize for, I guess, the rough connection we had at some moments. I guess overall it was pretty good. But, it's better to have the boss on here and communicate our knowledge to the masses as often as we can. Of course, the whole name of the game here is to support local business, but also inform local homeowners and anybody, for that matter, who's interested in understanding more about construction or whatever business or whatever trade we decide to have in the podcast space. So, again, thank you for tuning in, and it's been fine. It's been great, and we're hoping to see you guys next week, of course. We'll be going live again Thursday at 3 p.m., of course, so be sure to tune in, and in the meantime, take care and enjoy this year's snowfall, this first snowfall, which I think we're getting in a few days here. So anyways, take care, bundle up, and stay safe. Brody and Mike.